Hello, and welcome to the Psychologist Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Gamble. I'm an educational psychologist, professor, consultant, and coach. Psychology is the study of how to explain, predict, and modify behavior. However, for those who look at what the ancients in Africa and early Greece knew, it was the enlivenment and the illumination of the soul. Today, I want to talk about IQ, sports, and black men. Thank you for joining me. So I'll begin, as we like to do, with a few quotes. The first quote here is by the late educational psychologist Dr. Asa Hilliard, and he says, "I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There is no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings, and the second thing you do is love them." Some other quotes I have, and I have three. The first is, "Chronic means long-term. Traumatic means associated with trauma, and encephalopathy means a bad brain. CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy." And that's coming from Dr. Bennett Amalu. I have two more. Dr. Bennett Amalu studied NFL players and their brains after they had passed away. And he says, "No, I don't watch football. The last time I tried watching was the last Super Bowl. The problem is I have, the graphic nature of my imagination. When I watch and see them meeting head onto head, helmet onto helmet, what flashes through my mind is what's going on in their brains. It's like torture to me." In his last quote that I'm reading here, "There's no safe blow to the head, especially for a child." Again, that's Dr. Bennett Amalu, who studied chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And there was a movie made about him and his efforts at notifying the NFL about this challenge to men's brains who play the loved football in the United States in the National Football League, but also up north in the Canadian Football League and throughout college and sometimes elementary schools, where young men seek to bash their brains in by playing this game. Now, I've exposed my bias there, and if you look at any of my TED Talk, you'll see that I do talk about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the challenges that it has on folks. But let me pause and get into some of the news. June 2nd, this week in 2021, the National Public Radio reporting from Philadelphia says the NFL on Wednesday pledged to halt the use of race norming, which assumed black players started out with lower cognitive function. In the $1 billion settlement, it just blew my mind, $1 billion settlement of brain injury claims and review past scores for any potential race bias. The practice made it harder for black retirees to show a deficit and qualify for an award. So in other words, they were reviewing IQ scores of players. And for black players, they were discounting their overall IQ scores before they became players and looking at diminished capacity. And they're saying, well, they haven't diminished as much. Almost saying as if they're like mules who should have lower cognitive function because of their genetics. Well, I said almost. I don't want to go too far into that. Reading on in the NPR story, more than 2,000 NFL retirees have filed dementia claims, but fewer than 600 have actually received rewards from this billion-dollar settlement. My hometown hero, Junior Seau, in 2018, his family made a confidential settlement after the National Institutes of Health announced in 2013 that Seau's brain showed cellular changes consistent with CTE. These are symptoms of the condition includes headaches, depression, memory loss, and dementia. So as I think about my hometown hero, Junior Seau, and the way he took his life so that people could review and study his brain like Dr. Amalu. And think about so many other players, whether they played high school football, whether they played college football, whose brain capacity was diminished. So some of the concepts I want to share with you, and I have four. The first one is IQ, or intelligence quotient. And it's measured by taking a series of tests to take a look at how well people are able to solve problems, particularly able to utilize their memory, able to utilize their understanding of a problem-solving process, visual or auditory. And this full-scale score gives us an idea of how well someone might do educationally. So what's interesting about this intelligence quotient, it was thought for a while, up until the 70s, that black people had generally lower IQ than white people. But what was found out by two researchers named Dickens and Flynn in 2006, that testing between black and white Americans, this gap has dramatically closed during the period of 1972 and 2002, suggesting, in their words, the constancy of a black-white IQ gap is a myth. But yet, the challenge that these NFL players posed to the NFL was that there's not a gap within IQ. And if you think about the population of NFL players who are college educated, they're more likely to have high IQ. They have to memorize quite a few different things in order for them to make it to the NFL. They're the elite of the elite athletes. Right? Again, I talked about chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And it leads to diminished IQ for youth. There was a book by an author and journalist named Steve Allman, and it's called Against Football, One Man's Reluctant Manifesto. And he wrote out of a study that he did that players, particularly black young people who were living in the Deep South in Florida, who played football, each year that they played, their IQ diminished, which is interesting. But they're also different than NFL players in that they are still growing, but their IQ lagged behind their counterparts. So overall, anybody who plays football, their IQ is going to generally be lower or lowered. Going back to Dr. Malu's concern that there's no safe blow to the head, especially for a child. So as a boy, I thought my own worth was on the playing field. I had a cousin who played football and he broke his hip. My mother was very afraid of me playing any contact sports. But man, I really did wonder though, when I played these contact sports, was I good enough? Well, this is a matter of knowledge versus nature, right? Knowledge in the environment. And when we're measuring IQ, we have to wonder. So I'm going to give you kind of a abstract example, but then come back to something more specific. So there's this college bowl that our students from Oakwood University have participated in. And about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a question that was asked to some of the college bowl players. Now, you must know that Oakwood University has some of the top college bowl players. They answer trivia questions about historically black college life, but science, arts, all types of things. But they seem to have missed this very basic question about a fraternity that started in 1911, wears red and white, or better known as crimson and cream. They twirl canes, and even the host of that college bowl was wearing a crimson outfit. But the students from Oakwood did not know that it was my beloved fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Now, no one suggested that these students lacked intelligence, only exposure to information that students from other HBCUs know. I can also even go into that if I said America's team back in 1994, everyone would know who I was talking about, and that would be my beloved Dallas Cowboys. But today, young people in college, especially given, and I'll admit, my Cowboys losing record, may be more apt to talk about the women's soccer team. Time is the difference here rather than the environment or exposure to information. Really is the issue I'm talking about when it comes to this IQ gap, right? And one of my beloved elders from the Association of Black Psychologists, who has since passed on, his name is Dr. Robert L. Williams. He talked about black people and a test that would measure their basic intellectual and knowledge and cultural heterogeneity. This basic intelligence test of cultural heterogeneity, and you're hearing the acronym right, Dr. Williams does have a sense of humor. He was interested in finding out how much white people actually knew about black culture and life, which is what was going on with IQ tests back in well before the 2000s, which have been normed and become much better, but it's been a challenge. Now, moving back to this idea of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and IQ and all these other pieces, I just think it's a very interesting thing that we would send our best and brightest young men to go and challenge themselves by banging their heads together. But nonetheless, even when we do, we still need to take care of them because universities make billions of dollars off of them, offering their lives. I went to the University of Southern California and I never attended a game because of my concern for those young men. And I wonder, do people really love these black men, or do they love what they can do? That's a huge difference to me. Caring for people for who they are, simply for who they are, and not discounting them as well because of who they are. So I have some recommendations as we leave out here. As a parent, find out what CTE is before allowing your child to play any contact sport. That's baseball, football, even soccer, and making sure that their child is safe. Talk to your doctor if you played a contact sport since elementary school or secondary school, particularly in regards to issues around headaches, dizziness, distress, depression. These are some of the symptoms of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Remember, IQ is not static. It means that it's not going to stay the same, especially with a strong education. And if you have access to a strong education, good health care, you're more likely to be able to expand what you know. Moreover, no one race has a monopoly on knowledge, ability, or skills. We can all continue to grow and benefit from learning from one another. Infinite possibilities leads to infinite combinations of diversity, if I can paraphrase one of my favorite, Dr. Spock from Star Trek. Moving into the future, I pray that we're able to find ways to entertain ourselves that don't involve the people who are entertaining us in sport nearly killing themselves or jeopardizing their ability to utilize their brain. So access to quality in healthcare and education always leads to better outcomes. We have to prioritize our health in body and brain over a sport. Man. So next time, for more content, if you're interested, check out our Black History podcast. You can also take a look at drbrandongamble.com. You can follow The Gold Doctor on Facebook, Spotify, Spreaker, YouTube, and at golddoctor.net. Yes, that's www.golddoctor.net. Join me next time as we talk about the latest in psychology, news, concepts, and recommendation, and what is going on in this psychologist's mind. Hope you have a great day and continue to learn. Peace.